Welcome to our deep dive into pragmatism. We got some pretty cool excerpts from William James's Pragmatism, a new name for some old ways of thinking.
Yeah, it looks like someone out there is already pretty deep into this stuff.
Definitely seems that way. These lectures James gave back in the early 1900s, they're really a fascinating look at how he tried to bring philosophy down to earth. Make it relevant for everyone, not just the academics.
Yeah, he was all about making philosophy matter for everyday life.
Totally, and he tackles some seriously big questions right off the bat. One of the things that really jumped out at me in these excerpts was how he talks about temperament in philosophy.
Oh yeah, that's classic James.
He seems to be saying that a philosopher's personality, like their individual temperament, really shapes how they see the world.
Yeah, it's a big deal. And you know what? Most people don't even realize it.
So true. And then he goes on to make this distinction between tender-minded and tough-minded philosophers. And I noticed you marked this passage where James talks about the fear of death.
Yeah, that.
I was wondering, would you say that fear of death, that whole idea, fits more with the tender-minded or the tough-minded approach, and why?
It's a good catch. That fear of death thing with all its implications, afterlife, and yearning for something more than just the material world. That definitely leans towards the tender-minded perspective.
Yeah, I can see that.
It kind of suggests a longing for unity, a need for purpose and meaning that goes beyond, just the hard facts of our physical existence.
That makes a lot of sense. And it actually reminds me of another passage you marked where James talks about the tender-minded yearning for this feeling of wholeness and absolute unity in the universe.
Right, like they need everything to fit together perfectly.
It's like they're searching for some kind of cosmic guarantee that everything makes sense, that there's a bigger plan.
Exactly. While the tough-minded folks, with their focus on facts and skepticism, well, they might just see that desire for unity as wishful thinking.
A way to avoid facing the harsh realities. Okay, so I gotta ask, where do you see yourself on this whole spectrum? Are you more drawn to that tough-minded emphasis on facts and evidence, or do you find yourself leaning towards that tender-minded search for meaning and purpose?
Wow. You're really throwing down the gauntlet here. That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? I mean, philosophers have been wrestling with that one for centuries.
Right.
Honestly, I find myself pulled in both directions. I think a good dose of skepticism is essential for clear thinking. But I also totally get that human need for meaning and connection. You can't just ignore that.
That's where James's pragmatism comes in, right?
You got it.
It's like he's trying to bridge the gap between these two seemingly opposite ways of looking at the world.
Yeah, instead of getting stuck in these endless debates about abstract principles, pragmatism cuts to the chase. It focuses on what actually works.
How ideas play out in real life.
Right. It's like a call to action of philosophy you can actually use.
So it's about putting those ideas to the test, seeing where they lead us, what consequences they have.
And judging their truth by how effective they are in the real world.
And this whole idea of truth being dynamic. Something that's constantly evolving, something that happens to an idea as it's tested and verified, that really challenges that traditional view of truth as fixed and absolute, doesn't it?
Oh yeah, it totally flips the script.
I hadn't really thought about it like that before, but it makes a lot of sense when you consider how our understanding of the world is always changing, as we learn new things and have new experiences.
Our knowledge is constantly growing and evolving. So yeah, our concept of truth has got to be flexible enough to keep up with that.
Totally. You highlighted that really powerful story about the Cleveland working man who took his own life after losing his job.
Yeah, that one hit hard.
It's a stark reminder of how pointless all these abstract philosophical debates can seem when people are facing real suffering.
That's exactly why James felt it was so important to ground philosophy in real-life experience. For pragmatists, truth isn't some lofty concept. It's about what helps us deal with life's challenges and actually make the world a better place.
Makes you think, what's the point of an idea if it can't offer some guidance or comfort when things get tough?
It's a powerful question, gets right to the heart of what makes pragmatism so appealing.
That idea of an idea having cash value, It's like a reality check, know? It's not enough for an idea to sound good on paper. It's got to actually lead to something real, something that makes a difference in our lives.
You got it. And that leads us to something else.
Yeah.
James talks about something that might seem a little strange at first.
Go on.
He suggests that even our most basic assumptions about the world, the things we just take for granted as common sense.
Wait a minute, common sense. What's wrong with common sense?
Well, might not be as rock solid as we think.
Okay, now you've got me curious. Common sense is like our default setting for how we understand the world.
Right, it feels that way. But James throws a curveball.
Yeah.
He says common sense could actually be a bunch of really, really successful hypotheses that our ancestors came up with, passed down through generations because they worked.
Like a kind of inherited wisdom.
Exactly. Refined over centuries of trial and error.
But if it's worked for so long, why question it?
That's the thing about pragmatism. It pushes us to constantly test our assumptions, even the ones that seem totally obvious.
Makes sense.
Because what works in one situation might not work in another. And as we learn more about the world, those common sense ideas can start to fall apart.
This reminds me of that passage you highlighted where James talked about the limits of our mental categories.
Oh yeah, the fishbowl analogy.
He's saying our minds try to impose order on the world, even if that order is kind of artificial.
It's a great way to show how even our most basic ways of categorizing the world, like time, space, cause and effect, they're all just constructs of our minds.
So they're tools we use to make sense of things.
Exactly. Incredibly useful tools, but they might not reflect some ultimate reality.
Like we're looking at the world through a lens that shapes what we see.
And James would say it's super important to be aware of that lens, to recognize that our common sense categories are practical, but they're not absolute truths.
So if we can question even something as basic as common sense, what does that mean for how we understand reality? Does pragmatism lead to total skepticism where nothing is certain?
Not necessarily. James wasn't saying we should throw common sense out the window. He knew it was valuable for everyday life.
Right.
But he also wanted us to see it as a starting point, not the finish line. A set of hypotheses to be tested and refined, not a bunch of unbreakable truths.
So we can use common sense as a framework, but we got to be ready to adjust that framework as we encounter new information and have new experiences.
Exactly. It's about finding that sweet spot between practicality and intellectual humility.
I like that.
We need to be able to function in the world, to make decisions and take action.
Right. We can't just be paralyzed by doubt.
But we also need to be open to the possibility that we might be wrong, that there might be other ways of seeing things.
This reminds me of another thing James talked about, unstiffening our theories.
Oh yeah, I love that phrase.
He's basically saying we should loosen our grip on rigid, dogmatic ways of thinking and embrace a more flexible, adaptable approach to knowledge.
That's the heart of pragmatism. Embracing the fluidity and dynamism of reality, recognizing that our understanding is always evolving and that we got to be open to new perspectives and new ways of understanding the world.
So how do we actually do that? How do we unstiffen our thinking and become more pragmatic in how we approach knowledge?
For James, it starts with being willing to question our assumptions, to look for evidence that challenges our beliefs, and to admit that we might be wrong.
That's not always easy.
Nope, but it's crucial. And it's also about recognizing the practical consequences of our beliefs. Asking ourselves, what difference does it make if I believe this or that? What actions will it lead to?
It's about putting our beliefs into practice.
Exactly. And you mentioned earlier that James saw pragmatism as an extension of the scientific method into all areas of life.
Right. Not just science, but philosophy, ethics, even religion.
Right? Just like scientists test their hypotheses through observation and experimentation, James thought we should test our philosophical, ethical, and religious beliefs by seeing how they play out in the world, by checking out their practical consequences.
So it's not just about what feels good or sounds right. It's about what actually leads to a better life for ourselves and for others.
Bingo. And this emphasis on real-life experience and consequences brings us back to the core of pragmatism. It's all about finding what works, what helps us deal with the complexities of life, and what creates a more meaningful and purposeful existence.
So it's about more than just abstract ideas. It's about living a better life.
You got it.
It's fascinating how James connects truth to action and experience. He's basically saying truth isn't something we just passively receive, it's something we actively create through our engagement with the world.
That's a powerful insight. And it brings us to one of the most mind-blowing and maybe even controversial parts of James's thought, his view on the nature of reality itself. Remember that part where he talks about the universe being still in the making?
Oh yeah, that one really got me thinking. It challenges that traditional view of reality as fixed and complete, doesn't it?
Absolutely. This is where James's pragmatism takes a really radical turn. He's proposing that reality isn't something static and predetermined, but something dynamic and evolving, something that's constantly being shaped by our choices and actions.
Wait, so it's not just that our understanding of reality is changing, but that reality itself is in flux, constantly responding to how we interact with it.
That's the radical core of James's pragmatism, a concept that can be both exhilarating and a little scary. It suggests that we're not just passive observers in the universe, but active participants in its creation.
That's a huge idea to wrap your head around.
It is. It's a lot to take in.
But it also opens up so many possibilities. If reality really is in the making, then we have a responsibility to shape it in a way that reflects our values and aspirations.
Exactly. It's a call to action, an invitation to become co-creators of our own reality, both individually and collectively.
This whole idea of a universe that's still being made, it's really something. It suggests that our actions actually matter, that we're not just passengers, but we're actually helping to shape reality. And it makes me wonder how this idea works with religion. You mark that section where James compares absolute monism with pluralistic theism. It seems like those two views have very different ideas about the role of God in a universe that's still in progress.
Yeah, that's a good point. Those two views really show the contrast between the tender-minded and the tough-minded approaches to religion. Absolute monism, with its focus on unity and completeness, it kind of offers a sense of cosmic comfort, like everything is part of this perfect, unchanging whole, guided by some all-powerful divine force.
It's definitely a comforting thought, especially when things are uncertain or you're going through tough times. But I can also see how it could lead to a feeling of fatalism, like our individual actions don't really make a difference in the grand scheme of things.
Exactly. And that's where James, always the pragmatist, he challenges us to think about the practical implications. If everything is already decided, if free will is just an illusion, what does that mean for our lives, our choices, our sense of responsibility?
Yeah, that's a tough one. Philosophers and theologians have been wrestling with that question forever. And it seems like James, with his preference for pluralistic theism, he offers a different perspective. This idea of God as one powerful force among many, operating within a world that's still evolving. It suggests a much more active role for both God and humanity.
Right. Pluralistic theism fits really well with this idea of a universe in the making. It implies that God isn't just watching from afar, calling all the shots, but is actually working within the world, responding to our choices, and maybe even evolving along with creation.
So it's a more dynamic view of God, one that challenges those traditional ideas of God being all-powerful and unchanging. But how does this view explain religious experience? You highlighted that part where James talks about the importance of the will to believe. Is he saying that what we believe can actually affect our experience of God?
That's a tricky question, and James approached it carefully. He argued that in certain situations where there's not enough evidence or the evidence isn't clear, our passional nature, our desires, hopes, and fears can actually influence what we believe.
So it's not about blindly accepting anything, but acknowledging that sometimes our beliefs are shaped by more than just logic or empirical evidence.
Exactly. And when it comes to religion, this will to believe can be really powerful. If believing in God makes your life more meaningful and fulfilling, if it helps you deal with suffering and find purpose, then from a pragmatic viewpoint, that belief can be considered true for you.
That's interesting because it seems to shift the focus from trying to prove or disprove God's existence to looking at how the belief in God affects people's lives, how it shapes their experiences and actions.
Exactly. It reminds us that for James, truth isn't some static thing out there waiting to be found. It's a dynamic process, a kind of unfolding that happens as we interact with the world, test our beliefs, and see what consequences they have.
So even when it comes to religion, pragmatism encourages us to be open to new ideas, to question what we think we know, and to keep refining our understanding of the divine.
Absolutely. It's
Yeah.
about finding what works, what helps us live a more meaningful and fulfilling life, and what contributes to creating a better world.
This has been an amazing journey exploring pragmatism. We've dug into its main ideas, its challenge to traditional views of truth and reality, and even how it approaches religion. And it's clear that pragmatism isn't just some dry philosophical theory. It's a lively and dynamic way of engaging with the world.
It really is. And it's a philosophy that seems especially relevant today, in a world that's constantly changing, where old certainties are fading and new possibilities are emerging. Pragmatism invites us to embrace that change, to be open to new ideas, and to actively participate in shaping the future.
It's a call to action, an invitation to become more conscious and deliberate in creating our own reality. And with that, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the incredible world of William James and his pragmatic philosophy.
It's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you. And who knows, maybe this conversation will inspire our listeners to start their own pragmatic journeys, to test their beliefs, challenge their assumptions, and discover what truly works in their lives.